right, a couple other things to remind you about in the coming weeks. First of all, is that with missing next Tuesday, there is a video assignment that you are required to do. The details are on Blackboard. The link is on Blackboard under Assignments. It is the assignment essentially is watching a video documentary, first part of a documentary on Mormonism, an interesting world religion that I wish we had the time to cover, but with not having a class next Tuesday, we really don't have it in the schedule. So instead of having the opportunity to lecture, I'm having you watch this video. With the assignment on Blackboard are some questions. You need to answer those questions while watching the video, and then submit your answers to get credit for the video. The video is a part of your grade, so I would heavily encourage you to complete that. It is a done, not done type of assignment. You submit your answers to the question, you get all the points. If you don't submit any answers, you don't get the points. All right, so make sure to take the time to do that. You do have the entire week next week. They're not due until Sunday the 6th. But you do need to complete that. The video runs around 2 hours, so a little bit longer than what class would be. But don't forget to complete that. Also on Blackboard, under that assignment, are some key terms that you will need to know for the third exam. So there will be questions on the third exam about Mormonism. So not only do you need to complete the assignment, you need to take some notes so that you can prepare for the third exam. Also, next week, the third reflection paper is due a week from today. So make sure to take a look at that, complete that assignment on Blackboard as well. So the third reflection paper due a week from today. 2 weeks from today, I'm throwing a lot at you here, I know. 2 weeks from today is the second exam. And so what we're doing today, next Thursday, and then the following Tuesday are all part of that second exam. Study guide available on Blackboard. So make sure to take a look at the study guide. And if you have any questions, by all means get in contact with me about that. All right, so the reflection paper, the video assignment, and the exam all coming up within the next couple of weeks before spring break. Any questions about any of those assignments? Let's get into talking about Buddhism then. When it comes to talking about Buddhism, as we saw with Jainism and Sikhism, there will be some overlaps and similarities. There will be some areas of difference, hence the reason for an entirely new religion. It has to do with, there are different things. As we start off with Buddhism, one key aspect of Buddhism that is important to think about as far as a unifying factor, especially in contrasting Buddhism to Hinduism, is what's known as the triple gem. Now, just like we could talk about Hinduisms, we'll talk about Buddhisms in the sense of there are different approaches to Buddhism. But one thing unites them all, and this is the idea of the triple gem. Buddhists will talk about taking refuge in the triple gem. And this is the place of Buddhist identity. It is a recitation of these three things that marks one's conversion to Buddhism, and often they are recited in the context of starting a Buddhist ritual. And so people will say, first of all, that they take refuge in the Buddha. Now, here again, right, this is a unifying factor. Right? This is one thing that all Buddhists share. They'll think differently about what the Buddha represents, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. Right? For some, it is about the historical individual Siddhartha Gautama For others, there are claims that he is just one representative of a long line of Buddhas or teachers, enlightened ones. But Buddhists will take refuge in the Buddha. They will take refuge in the Dharma. Now remember, in Hinduism, Dharma refers to one's obligations, things that one must do. In Buddhism, however, the term Dharma refers to the Buddha's teachings. Now again, I won't necessarily put an exam or a question on the exam that would be something to try and confuse you between these two meanings of Dharma, but it's an important aspect to remember. And then finally, the third part here is the Sangha, or the Buddhist community. It is these three things that tie Buddhists together across the different types. And so we'll use these three to kind of outline the rest of what we'll look at with Buddhism. But before we get into talking about the Buddha, I want to start first by setting the context. Buddhism develops in the 6th century before Christ. A very important period. And an important period across the board. It's not just important in India. I mean, in the 6th century, the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. In the 6th century, Confucius, who we'll talk about later in the class, he's doing his teachings. Right? There are things going on in Greece in the 6th century BC. Right? So there's all sorts of things going on. There's this moment in world history that is significant in a wide variety of places, and especially in India. And when it comes to thinking about what's going on in 6th century India, in many respects, it's a time of spiritual questioning. Now remember, India, this time period we're talking about, it's that Vedic religion, right? The religion of the priests, the religions of sacrifice, that has held sway for 1,000+ years. But in this period of time, right, the late 7th into the 6th century, there's a lot of people beginning to question the ideology of sacrifice, the ideology, the power of the Brahmins. It's a time of transformation. Remember, this is the time period when the Upanishads developed, right, that more philosophical approach to Hinduism. And so a lot of the Vedic religion, a lot of the work of the priests, it's becoming less plausible, it's less valid. And so we see a wide variety of religious teachers developing at this time. Predominantly the only ones really remembered are the Upanishads and the Jains. We talked about that, Vardhamana, Mahavira at the same time here, as well as, of course, Buddhism. It is a time period of a variety of spiritual seeking as well. These individuals, these seekers, often referred to as Shramanas. Predominantly, a lot of the Shramanas were in the student stage of life in Hinduism. They're in their 20s, maybe into their late 20s, but they've kind of given up on this path that would take them from being a student into being a householder and all the responsibilities with respect to that. And they said they're giving all of that up and going out and wandering and looking for enlightenment. And these were people that decided that one of the major ways to experience enlightenment was to live that ascetic lifestyle. So they would stand out in the rain, they would stand out in the heat, they would stand out in the cold, and they would sleep on the ground. They would go up without food and water for long periods of time, all with the hope of receiving this spiritual enlightenment. India, of course, at the time is also very heavily influenced by the caste society. In fact, in many respects, it's still a very important part of Indian life. And so this is a time period where there are a lot of changes going on that are causing some tensions within that caste society. People are becoming more urban in India. They're shifting to a market economy. They're moving away from agriculture so much, turning to trade. And with that comes a wide variety of conflicts. There's economic conflict. The merchant class, which is lower on the social level, right? The merchants are that third level. But they're starting to have more power because as trade, as the market economy, as money becomes a big thing in India, those merchants believe that they should have more power instead of the priests, instead of the warriors. And there's social conflict and caste system, and of course religious and philosophical conflict. So the time period in which Buddhism develops is a time period where a lot of things are going on, a lot of changes are going on that allow for this new view of the world to come forward, particularly through the teachings of a man named Siddhartha. Siddhartha develops Buddhism, the beginnings of Buddhism, as an Indian religion. Just as I mentioned when we were talking about Jainism and Sikhism, because it is an Indian religion, it finds itself, right, early Buddhists find themselves in the position of taking concepts and ideas that were present in Hinduism and reinterpreting them. And so karma, samsara, all of these are things that Buddhists are either giving up or they're reinterpreting. It's unclear exactly when the man named Siddhartha, the man who would be the Buddha, was born. Some would be dates earlier than 563, so in the 600s, some in the late 400s. Most scholars in the West tend to favor these dates, 563 to 483. An 80-year period is usually what's given for his life. But again, you don't necessarily need to know these dates for an exam, but to just give you an idea of when he's born. There are a lot of legends that developed around later on the Buddha's birth. For example, a story about his mother having a dream in which an elephant enters her side, and that's how the Buddha is conceived. There are legends about him having different marks on his body that were to indicate that he was going to be a very important person. Right? Some of these might have had a basis in actual historical fact. Others we're not sure of. What does seem to be the case, though, is that he was born to Kshatriya class parents. Right? So that sect class, that ruling warrior class. And they appear to have been rulers of a small little region near the foothills of the Himalayas, what's today southern Nepal. They named him Siddhartha, which means one who attains the goal, or a successful one. So by naming him this, of course, they're suggesting that he's going to be a successful person. They're hoping that he's going to be successful. In addition to Siddhartha, the Buddha, in some cases you might see the phrase Shakyamuni. It means Shakyan sage. Shakya is the region in which Gautama and his family lived. The name is predominant in forms of Buddhism found in China and Japan. That's the term that they tend to use. It also appears to be the case that when Siddhartha was rather young, his mother passed away. And his father, who is hoping that Siddhartha will one day succeed him to the rule of this area, tries to raise his son in a way that he's going to keep him from any sort of unpleasantness. And so he doesn't want Siddhartha to see anybody sick. He doesn't want him to see anybody suffering from the struggles of old age or poverty. And so Siddhartha lives a life of pampering, of luxury, all to keep him from life's hard realities. Until about the age of 30. Siddhartha goes on a chariot ride And this ride, at least according to the traditions, will change his life. As he's going on this ride, he sees what are called the four sights, four individuals. He sees a sick person, a suffering person, an old person, and then a dead body. Now remember, this is his first exposure with the unpleasantness of life, and so he's very confused. He doesn't understand what's going on. But his chariot driver explains to him, this is the harsh reality of life. People get sick, they suffer, they get old, they die. I'm sorry, I gave you the sick man. I'm sorry, giving you the sights wrong. Sick man, suffering old man, so the suffering and age were together. And then the third is a dead body. We'll get to the fourth here in just a minute. So here he is. His world has been shaken. But the fourth sight is of a contented monk with a blissful smile on his face. And so this fourth sight offers Siddhartha the possibility that there is some way to escape these terrible things, right? So here's this monk who knows the horrible things of sickness, old age, and death, yet there's still something that has allowed him to be happy in this life. And so the spiritual emptiness he's feeling, he decides there must be a response to it. And so Siddhartha decides he's going to abandon his life. And he's going to give up his wealth, he's going to give up his position, and go and look for enlightenment. Well, the first thing he decides to do is kind of go the exact opposite of his life as he's known it up to this point. Right? So I've lived a life where I've been pampered, I've had all my needs met, I've never seen any problems. I'm going to go the exact opposite way. And so he decides that a rigorous ascetic life is the answer. And so he will stand, and just stand outside for long periods of time, no matter what the weather. He'll decide to sit still for long periods of time. He will go to the extremes in fasting. According to traditions, he gets down to a few grains of rice and a palmful of water a day. He does not achieve enlightenment. Instead, he becomes extremely thin and passes out a lot. As you would expect if you're drinking very little, eating very little, out in the cold, the rain, and the heat. And so he decides, right, that's not working either. But he still wants to achieve enlightenment. This is his goal. And so enlightenment is not found in luxury. Enlightenment is not found in extreme asceticism. Instead, it must be found in a path of moderation, a middle path. And so he begins to meditate, begins to follow this middle path. And according to the tradition, while sitting under a tree, he begins to feel this blissfulness. He begins to have a remembrance of all of his past lives and comes to spiritual insight. And specifically, his insight is related to the twin forces of suffering and desire. Which leads us into the second gem. But before we move on into the Buddhist Dharma, I want to pause and ask, are there any questions, anything I need to clarify and explain? All right, so the life of the historical Buddha. Let's go to the second gem, the Dharma. Most people would date this age of enlightenment around 35. All right, so he is 6 years looking for enlightenment. And it's at this time that he becomes a Buddha. The term Buddha means enlightened one. So he's experienced enlightenment. And for the next 45 years, he travels, shares his insight and his dharma, his teaching. His first sermon, discourse, is referred to as the wheel-turning discourse, the Dharma Chakra, setting the wheel of Dharma in motion. Essentially, what he is encouraging people to undergo is the search for nirvana, the search for enlightenment. And specifically, as we've already said, that this enlightenment, this nirvana, is found through this path of moderation shaped by the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths become a very key part of the Buddhist Dharma. They are four truths about the human condition, as the Buddha sees it, the way to escape that condition, and to achieve nirvana. It is supposedly the realization of these truths is what led the Buddha to become the Buddha. The first of the Noble Truths is that all life entails suffering, or dukkha. Again, you don't necessarily need to know the, in this case, Pali terms. This is called the truth of suffering. Now, this is not just some sort of pessimistic statement, right? This is not the Buddha saying, oh, life is terrible, or oh, life is hard. No, instead, it's meant to be this clear recognition about the life being unsatisfying. Death is inescapable, and even pleasure and good times in life are only temporary. They are inadequate. And so to be attached to anything in this life is to be attached to suffering. You're always going to find yourself with inadequate things. The cause of suffering, said the Buddha, is Trishna, which has been variously translated as desire or thirst. This is called the truth of origin. Where does suffering come from? Now, Trishna here refers to possessions, right? We want possessions, or we want power, or we want sex, or we want all sorts of different things we try to fill our lives with, and when those desires turn out to not be fulfilled, we experience suffering. Even the desire for enlightenment can be a type of thirst that will lead to suffering. And so because desire is what continues to cause suffering in someone's life, the only way to deal with this is through detachment. Desire keeps one bound to samsara. Desire keeps one bound to this continual cycle of death and rebirth. To remove suffering, you must remove desire. You must adopt an attitude of detachment. This is called the truth of cessation. Desire and suffering are in a cause and effect relationship. But it can be reversed and ultimately extinguished in nirvana. The way to extinguish this, the way to remove desire, is through the Eightfold Path. This is the path to the escape from samsara. This is the way to progress toward enlightenment. And as you progress, as you study, as you meditate, as you experientially come to knowledge, your understanding of the Noble Truths is to deepen. The Eightfold Path consists of 8 characteristics: right view, right intentions, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right concentration, and right mindfulness. You don't necessarily need to know these specific things. Instead, I want you to see how they're kind of grouped into three sets. Ethical compassion, mental discipline, and wisdom. Right? So ethical compassion, right view, right intentions. Mental discipline, right speech, right action, right livelihood. Right effort, right concentration, right mindfulness is mental discipline. And then wisdom, one of those things. Ethical compassion, right speech, right action, right livelihood. Mental discipline, right effort, right concentration, right mindfulness. Wisdom, right view, right intentions. One more time. Ethical compassion, right speech, right action, right livelihood. Mental discipline, right effort, right concentration, right mindfulness. Wisdom, right view, right intentions. Now, right here doesn't necessarily mean something having the correct view or having the correct speech, but instead refers to being skillful at speech, skillful with respect to mindfulness. Encouraging the maturity, right, a deepening of all of these things. When it comes to right speech, it would be things like avoiding lying, avoiding gossip, any sort of frivolous speech. Right action would, of course, include not killing or stealing, refraining from harm. Right livelihood is a recognition that in your career, you should take a job that is not going to cause harm to people. It's not going to take advantage of people. And then, of course, it would be things like, inflicting harm, killing, but casting magic spells, right? So you shouldn't be a sorcerer. Right effort, mindfulness, and concentration refer to Buddhist meditation practices. Right effort here refers to the ideas of engaging in effort to clear the mind, being able to experience that mindfulness, which is Buddhist meditation, which would cultivate detachment. Right concentration refers to advanced meditation. And all of this then brings about right views of the Noble Truths, and then right thoughts and intentions, shaped by detachment from hatred and cruelty. But all of these, of course, are interconnected and should be thought of as circular, that as you become more skillful in these things, it will lead you to be more skillful in others. But they're also interconnected. Moral progress, right speech, action, livelihood. Moral progress is essential for the appropriate meditation. Right? So you can't meditate properly if you're not living ethically. And that right meditation is needed in order to have insight. Of course, insight will lead you to be better morally as well. And so they're kind of circular and supporting each other. What questions so far? It appears like many other prominent religious teachers, the Buddha did not write anything down. Or if he did, it's been lost to history. And again, much like many other religious teachers, a lot of what he taught was shared orally with his disciples, his followers, that was then passed on through communities. However, around the 1st century CE, or the 1st century AD, monks started copying down the Buddhist teaching. It appears that there were a variety of famines that led to the death of many monks. And so the number of monks is going down, and so there's this concern. If we don't write these things down, they will pass out of history. And so, at least according to the traditions, they wrote down the Buddhist teaching on palm leaves, and then took those palm leaves and separated them into 3 different baskets. based on what they were about. And so this set of scriptures is referred to as the Tripitaka, or the three baskets. Not everything in the Tripitaka comes from the Buddha himself. Some of his close disciples are also credited with some of this information. The first basket that they threw palm leaves into was the sutra basket, or discourses. Essentially, these were talks, we might use the term sermons, by the Buddha or his early disciples, but they weren't necessarily always formal. Much like Jesus, much like Socrates, other people like that, usually a lot of these things were in response to questions. So people would ask the Buddha a question, or they would ask one of the Buddha's disciples a question, and then that person would pontificate. Well, those types of writings went into the sutra basket. The second of the baskets was the Vinaya, or monastic discipline basket. Guidelines about how to live as a monk or a nun. Rules about the Sangha, the community. It also included stories about how and why the Buddha instituted these rules. The third basket within the Tripitaka was the Abhidharma, the additional teachings. Essentially, these are more philosophical texts about the nature of reality, the nature of the self, what consciousness was. And they tend to be more of information and talks and ideas given by early Buddhists rather than the Buddha himself. These texts were written in Pali, the language Pali, and so they are sometimes referred to as the Pali Canon. Canon referring to a set of scriptures or a list of authoritative books. Because of the influence of Pali on a lot of early Buddhism, there are some cases where things are slightly different. Sometimes, instead of karma, which is a Sanskrit term, you might hear or read about kama, which is the Pali term. Dharma, Dhamma, similar types of things. And it's because of both languages being used in early Buddhism. Other important things out of Buddhist Dharma include some important key concepts. We're obviously not going to deal with all of them, but there are a couple that I would like to point out as we think here about the teachings. Another thing to note. This is obviously a statue of the Buddha. But thinking of how you've seen the Buddha sometimes depicted, what's different about this statue from others? He's not fat. Fat statues are not depictions of the Buddha. They are actually Chinese kitchen guns. And the Buddha was not fat. Remember, he lived a life of moderation. And so if you see a statue, somebody says it's the Buddha, it's not really the Buddha. Whether that actually looks like the Buddha or not, I don't know that either. But so the fat statues are not the Buddha. And so it comes more from the Chinese tradition. So anyway, that was a little sidelight. Common doctrines. In order to achieve nirvana, enlightenment, one must have wisdom or insight, what's known by the term prajna. Prajna refers to the insight to seeing the world as it really is. Particularly seeing the world as made up of suffering and impermanence. As one gains this insight, one moves along to nirvana, enlightenment. And after death, one who has experienced enlightenment, experienced nirvana, will experience peri-nirvana, or final enlightenment, or final nirvana. This is the escape from samsara. Someone who has achieved nirvana will not be reborn, except in a few limited situations that we'll talk about either today or next Thursday. So what is this state of final nirvana? Well, it's not heaven. And so the idea of a place that one goes to after death, isn't the same kind of concept like we would think in the monotheistic. But there is this idea of some sort of existence after death, or that final death. Often it's kind of compared to the extinguishing of a flame, with the idea that the flames of an extinguished fire are being released to return to this diffuse, unagitated, and eternal state. And so peri-nirvana is this idea of freedom, yet also existence, in an eternal state that's beyond all material description. You don't have a physical existence, but you still are a part of the universe. And a lot of that is related to another key concept known as anatman, the idea of the non-self. Atman, of course, in Hinduism, referred to that expression of Brahman that we often think of as the individual soul. But within the Buddhist teaching, there is no essential, unchanging, interior entity at the center of a person. There is no notion in Buddhism of an eternal soul. So that, with respect to that, there should be no thing to be attached to, no thing that should be desired. Essentially, when it comes to the self, a person on any turn of samsara is a combination of 5 elements, or skandhas: the physical body, the feelings, the understanding, the will, and the consciousness. And so these 5 things come together to make up a person on a particular turn of samsara. But there is no notion of endurance in an eternal way of any of these things. It's a very difficult concept to get and try to explain. But often, early Buddhists use the example of a chariot to try and explain. A chariot, if you kind of break it down, it's got wheels, it's got the framework, it's got ropes, it's got the spokes in the wheels. But no one part of a chariot is considered to be a chariot. If I held up a wheel and said, "Is this a chariot?" you would say, "No." Right? That's a wheel. The same kind of thing applies to the Buddhist conception of the self. Pointing to a physical body. A physical body without feelings, understanding, will, and consciousness is not a person. Now again, in the West, we would probably say consciousness is connected with the soul. Right? So consciousness is the soul. That's the person. Well, consciousness is not the person. Because in the next turn of samsara, any sort of consciousness that extends from one life to the next will be combined with a new will, a new understanding, new feelings, and a new physical body. And that makes a person. So there's nothing eternal about a person. Now, yes, there is some, the consciousness does kind of extend into the next life, but it's not unchanged. It's not the same complete eternal consciousness. But the fact that it continues that's where karma is kind of connected. And karma kind of continues because it's connected with a specific consciousness. Now again, we might say, Well, isn't that, though, a person? But just like a wheel is not a chariot, a consciousness is not a person for Buddhists. Again, it's kind of a difficult concept to get our minds around and to try and explain as Westerners, because we are so used to the idea of, that voice in my head, that place where I think, that's truly me, and that's what's going to live on. But for Buddhists, that's not the case. But instead, the self, just like everything else, is marked by impermanence. The self is impermanent. The world around us is impermanent. Our relationships are impermanent, right? Everything we can think of is impermanent. But everything in our lives is also interdependent. The picture for this, to try and suggest this, is of a wheel made up of usually 12 components or 12 spokes. Again, you don't necessarily need to get the terms down, instead hopefully kind of getting the concept. Essentially, the idea is that each of these conditions have an impact on our lives. Things happened in our past life that have led to present situations which are leading to things that we are doing that will affect our future life. So we had ignorance of the way the world works, of reality, of the self, of detachment, and that led to that aspect, right, that little thing that carries on. So at death, we had those mental formations that continued on, that became a new consciousness, that were then combined with will, feelings, a new body, which gave us senses, right? There's six senses in Buddhist conception, which now leads us to come into contact with things through our senses, which gives us feelings. Right? So we have senses, so we have feelings about things, which makes us crave or thirst or desire things, which will lead to attachment, which will put us in a position of we're not going to escape samsara, we are going to become somebody new. Right? There will be a new birth, there will be aging and death, and the wheel just keeps on. Right? And so our ignorance of impermanence, our ignorance of how what we've done in our past life is affecting this life, and if we don't change it, right, if we don't spiritually exert ourselves to discover the truth about this, the insight, the wisdom that we need, we're just going to keep spinning around and around on this wheel, being reborn life after life. Questions about this idea? Anything I need to clarify so far? Also very important, as we suggested already, is that human beings, as Buddhists, be moral. Morality is key on the steps to the path to finding nirvana. It is important to make good karma. We'll talk about karma here in a minute. And popular stories in Buddhism emphasize that one should act morally to all beings, because Buddhists also consider the world to be eternal, and so at one point, all the beings we come in contact with in a life have been our parents, or they have been our children, or they have been related to us in some way. So act morally toward all people and all beings. When it comes to the issue of karma, there are certainly similarities. That kind of good consequences proceed out of good actions, bad consequences proceed out of bad actions, but there are slight differences. For example, most Buddhists would say not not everything that one experiences in life is dependent upon karma. But on the other hand, you should do good deeds to offset karmic destiny. They also deny the position found within Hinduism of karma and caste. I mean, they live in a system of caste in India, but anybody, regardless of caste, can achieve nirvana. Unlike in Hinduism, where karma explains why you are in the position you are in. Within Hinduism, karma is related specifically to actions. Very physical concept. Within Buddhism, karma is more an energy from action. Right? So it's more of a psychological concept than a physical one, which of course is different from the material concept of Jainism, where karma is material particles that attach itself to your soul. Questions about any of these doctrines? Anything we need to clarify? Let's move on then into talking about the third gem, the Sangha. The Sangha, again, refers to the community, those that follow the Dharma or the teachings of the Buddha. There are essentially two parts in the Sangha. The monastic community, monks and nuns, and common people, lay people. And just like in other communities, monasticism requires a high level of devotion. Right? You're changing your entire lifestyle practice. Turn into a very simple type of lifestyle. And like in other forms of monasticism, taking a variety of vows, chastity, poverty, separation from the world, living in a monastery, for example. The global Sangha, the worldwide Buddhist community, has experienced a variety of separations beginning as early as the 4th century BC. Essentially, there are three major schools. At one point, there were like 18 different groups of Buddhists. And a lot of the major splits in those early years had to do with how an individual became a part of the monastic community, what kind of vows they had to take, what they could and could not do as monks. And so a lot of it had to do with that. But there was a lot of working together, living together in the same kind of monasteries. But essentially today there are three major types left. There's Theravada. Theravada predominantly found in Southeast Asia, so places like Vietnam, Laos, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Certainly, of course, Theravada Buddhists found elsewhere, but as far as concentration, Southeast Asia, Mahayana, East Asia, China, Japan, and then Vajrayana predominantly in Tibet, although there is a significant diaspora of Tibetan Buddhists in India. We'll talk more about that when we come to Tibetan Buddhism. Of those 18 schools back in the 3rd, 4th century BC, the only one that continues to survive is Theravada. The term is a Pali term that means the way of the elders. So it's a rather ancient form of Buddhism. It is believed to be the oldest living form of Buddhism, the one that has the most age to it. There were modes of Buddhism that were older, but they have died out, at least apparently. And as the oldest form, as the tradition of the elders, the way of the elders, it tends to be a rather conservative form of Buddhism. And so the Theravadas believed that it was very important for them to try to maintain Buddhism in its original form. And quite possibly, the practices of Theravadas are closer to what the Buddha actually prescribed. More modern forms like Mahayana and Vajrayana have innovations. There have been newer things that have been added. As I mentioned, Theravada predominantly found in Southeast Asia, places like Vietnam, Cambodia, Sri Lanka. A main focus for Theravada is on study and meditation with respect to the Four Noble Truths. Vitally important for the Theravadan to focus on these truths, meditating, coming to deeper insight, but especially through monasticism. In Theravada Buddhism, it is emphasized that one must become a monk or a nun, predominantly a monk in Theravada, to achieve nirvana. That there's just so much in a person's regular life that they cannot achieve nirvana. That you have to be totally detached, essentially, from the world, so you can focus on meditation. But it tends also to be a rather individualistic form of Buddhism. The ideal person in Buddhism, in Theravada, is the arhat. The term means something like worthy one. This is someone who has or will achieve nirvana through self-effort. And so this is a person who has, on their own, brought themselves to nirvana. The second major type of Theravada Buddhism, or second major type of Buddhism, is Mahayana. Mahayana, however, is an umbrella term for other types, and we'll talk about some other divisions within Mahayana, but as far as an umbrella term. The term Mahayana means greater vehicle. It's more about universal salvation, getting as many people as possible to nirvana. It begins to develop around the 1st century CE, the Common Era, or AD, and started to refer to older forms of Buddhism, including Theravada, as Hinayana, a lesser vehicle. By the 4th century, so within 300 years, it had become the most prominent form of Buddhism, particularly through traveling to East Asia. But in addition to the numerical difference, there are other differences as well. For Theravada, the emphasis is on the monastic life to achieve liberation, to achieve nirvana. Mahayana forms argue that common people can strive for and achieve nirvana. Theravada Buddhists tend to focus predominantly and exclusively on the historical Buddha. Just pay attention to him. Within Mahayana, many forms of Mahayana, Siddhartha Gautama is just one manifestation of Buddhahood. There have been others, scores of others throughout time from Mahayanas, who have achieved enlightenment, who can serve as examples. Within Theravada, the emphasis is on personal effort. But within Mahayana, the heavens are filled with those, with spirit beings who are willing to help. These individuals are known as bodhisattvas. The term bodhisattva means something like enlightenment hero. And this is someone who could achieve that final nirvana, but chooses not to in order to help others. Right? So they could be, experience that release into the universe, but they want to see other people experience nirvana. And it's the fact that they're willing to forego this final nirvana that demonstrates the freedom from desire that they have, their detachment from themselves, and the fact that they embody the compassion that is so important within the Buddhist community. Let's go ahead and quit there. We're quitting a little bit early, but we'll go ahead and finish up there. We'll pick up a week from today, talk more about some specific types of Mahayana, and then get into Vajrayana as well as some Buddhist practice. Don't forget, no class on Tuesday. Third review essay on Thursday a week. Second exam Thursday in 2 weeks.